And in fact, this first session is Implementations Lesson Learned. And we are very thankful and grateful that we have 4 individuals on this panel who have been deeply involved in social emotional learning work for decades, actually. And the insights that they bring, the thoughtfulness that they bring to this work has been remarkable. I've actually worked with all of them at various times. I have the deepest respect and regard, not only for the individuals, but their organizations and the value that they've brought to social emotional learning. I will say that in the Padlet, there are resources that each of these individuals have posted. You're welcome to access those and download them. And they're available for anyone, and they'll be available after the summit as well. So let me do a brief introduction of each of these. Their bios are in the program, and so you can look at the more elaborate ones in the program. But let me go person by person. I'm going to introduce Dimitri Anselm first, who's the Executive Program Director for Professional Learning and Educator Support at Facing History and Ourselves. In his 20 years with Facing History, he's worked with hundreds of school districts on program implementation and brings a wealth of insight to us today. So welcome, Dimitri. Peter Brun is the Vice President for Organizational Learning at the Center for the Collaborative Classroom, as well as its prior incarnation as the Developmental Studies Center, which I have to say was one of the organizations that frankly launched work in this area in a very instrumental way. He's also spent the past 2 decades working on implementation of social emotional learning and its integration into the reading curriculum with hundreds of school districts. In fact, has extensively worked in the area of reading as well. Larry Derringer is the Executive Director of Engaging Schools, which focuses primarily on supporting schools and districts on the implementation of social emotional learning. He's been with Engaging Schools and its predecessor organization, Educators for Social Responsibility, for over 30 years and brings a rich range of experience working with districts on program implementation. So welcome, Larry. And then finally, Laura Hodges is the Executive Director of the Center for Responsive Schools. Her 40-year career in education includes being a teacher, principal, associate superintendent for curriculum and instruction, as well as a deputy executive director of a university-based center providing support and technical assistance to school districts. She was also a senior consultant for Castle, coaching districts on SEL implementation. So she's seen this not only from a program position, but up close as working with districts. I actually can't imagine a panel of people more experienced in what works in implementation, and I want to thank all of you for being here. It's just an honor to have you here. To open the panel, I believe that our participants would like to hear a bit about your background, a little bit more about the work you've done with schools and school districts on social emotional learning. So can you share with us what your organization does, your role in the organization, and how your organization supports schools and implementation? I'm going to begin with Laura.
Thank you, Shelley, and thank you to my colleagues who are here and to the team of educators who are here as well. I'm Laura Hodges. I'm the CEO of the Center for Responsive Schools. CRS the center is a 40-year, it's in its 40th year. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. And our flagship program is Responsive Classroom. We serve about 5,100 schools, which is roughly about 17,000 teachers and 5 million students each year through the Responsive Classroom approach to teaching that's across the nation and across the world. We also have a publishing house where we publish not only Responsive Classroom books, but other professional development books that are of relevance and importance to educators. And we've most recently launched a K-8 social and emotional learning curriculum in response to the educators who adopt Responsive Classroom. When they adopt the Responsive Classroom approach, they essentially adopt the concepts that the academic and the social and emotional learning curriculum are equally important. And over the years, they've asked us, well, where is that curriculum where we can explicitly teach it? And it is aligned to the Responsive Classroom's social emotional competencies. So we launched that curriculum. So that's a little bit about us and me and our organization. Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you, Laura. Larry, let me go to you next.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Larry Derringer. I am the Executive Director of Engaging Schools. We're a national nonprofit organization. We specialize in services for middle and high schools. Our mission is really to collaborate with educators to create equitable and engaging classrooms and schools and districts, and ones that really emphasize integrating academic, social, and emotional learning and development. We have 3 core services that we offer. We help schools to implement the engaged classrooms approach, and there's an emphasis in that program on embedding SEL in daily practice in middle and high school classrooms. We help schools to implement climate and culture initiatives that align tightly with SEL. We also help whole districts. We partner with whole districts to do what we call recalibrating a code of character, conduct, and support that's intended to place equity and SEL at the center of the code. So those are our core services. The other thing I'll close in saying is that several years ago, we developed what we call learning and life competencies for school, college, and career success. And really what we did is we created a synthesis of SEL, academic, and post-secondary competencies that seemed especially appropriate for middle and high schools, and also for adolescents, for the developmental and cultural needs of adolescents. And we call these the LLCs. They're at the heart of our work.
Great. Thank you, Larry. Peter?
Thanks. I'm Peter Brun. I'm the Vice President for Organizational Learning at Center for a Collaborative Classroom. I think you'll hear in a lot of the sort of discussions of what our organization does, lots of similarities with the other partner organizations here. I think we're really complementary in how we look at teaching and learning, especially this idea of integrating academic and social development. I know it's something Laura and Larry talked about. We've been around as a nonprofit organization since 1980, really centering on that intersection of academic and social development, wrestling really with this question of how do we do this work and have an impact at scale? How do we think about doing that, not just in a few schools, but how do we think about doing it in many schools? And the way we've sort of tried to solve that problem and sort of wrestle with this is to integrate this work into curriculum. And so we've thought deeply about both with our Caring School Community curriculum, which is an SEL curriculum for K-8, and our K-6 literacy curriculum, collaborative literacy, thinking about what are the research-based practices or evidence-based practices that we can build into curriculum that is educative in a way that helps teachers learn as they teach, and so that kids get the experiences they need to thrive. And so we've been doing that since 1980, as I said, and working with lots of partner districts throughout the country. And that's ostensibly what we do.
Great. Thanks, Peter. And Dimitri?
Thank you. Like Peter mentioned, we really, all 4 of us are occupy similar space, and we collaborate in terms of the way we think of the work. So Facing History and Ourselves was founded in 1976, and since then we've been working mostly with middle schools and high school students and their teachers across the country and internationally. We sit at the integration of SEL, equity, and civic education, thinking deeply about all 3 of those and how to make these things come alive in the classroom, in the teaching practices, in the whole school practices that are necessary to wrap around this content. So our mission is to use the lessons of history to challenge teachers and their students to stand up to bigotry and hate. So in the history classroom and the ELA classroom, we offer resources, materials for looking at history, looking at these moments of fractures, but also inviting students to think of their own agency for repair, reconstruction, and rebuild. We also do a lot of our work similar to what my colleagues have talked about, offer professional development to educators. Teachers choose to integrate our resources into already established courses where it makes sense to them, where the standards will allow, and In addition to the professional development learning we also offer one-on-one coaching and support in schools to those who are implementing.
Great, thanks, Dimitri. As I think our the audience can see, this is organizations that go deep with districts and have a rich experience. So the core question for participants who are attending today is how best to plan for successful implementation of social emotional learning and how to avoid the potholes and dead ends that emerge along the way. So let me begin that conversation by asking you, when you think of the schools and districts that were most successful in their implementation, what do you think are the most critical 2 or 3 actions that they took that promote effective implementation? And Peter, let me begin with you on that.
This is, so I think probably for all of us, it's a question we really struggle with, because at the end of the day, sort of what happens between teachers and kids fundamentally is where the success for this work lies. And I think a couple big things that I think about. Typically, when we're talking with schools and districts, one of the things that that often happens in schools is that SEL work sometimes can get siloed, and siloed in a way where it isn't centered with teaching and learning. So sometimes this decision is actually made and starts actually at the district level, and sometimes when districts are deciding like they're going to embrace the social emotional learning curriculum, the folks that are at the table to plan that work, that help schools and teachers and principals think about where this is going to sit in their day, and helping them with some of the professional learning and instructional practices that they're going to need to be successful. A lot of those folks actually aren't from teaching and learning. And when we have folks that are leading this work that don't have the sort of teaching and learning background, we've really struggled in our work when that's happened. It's been one of the places where it's really difficult, because teachers then don't start with the message that this is fundamental to our practice. It almost comes across as ancillary. While that might not seem as a big decision as we're making this, because I think sometimes funding drives where a program sits at the district level, whether it comes from school health or whether it comes through Title IV or whether it's a grant funded project that has a special office now. I guess the biggest thing, the pitfall I could say to avoid that sort of starts this often on the wrong foot, is not putting this in teaching and learning, because at least for our work, it's putting this in teaching and learning is sort of central to getting teachers the support they need, and getting helping them solve some of the problems they're going to encounter when they start to teach the work.
Thanks, Peter. Laura, you work in the more the K-8 range. How does this? What are the insights that you can offer about what accounts for success, and what actions school districts can take to promote success?
I would offer a three-point plan, Shelley. And the first one is start with a multi-year plan. It's that this isn't something that you just start one year and you quit, or it's not. It's a long-term solution, and so you have to have a multi-year plan, a multi-year commitment to the work. Because social and emotional learning is core to success. It's core to getting students college and career ready. So these are the skills that we want people to have when they go into the real world, when they go into college. These are the skills that underlie academic success. So it's not a one and done. So you start the first success, I think the most successful districts start with a multi-year plan. That would be the first thing. And then they establish a foundation to make sure that the program outlives leader attrition, because sometimes leaders leave, programs leave. So beyond the leader, who is the person or the persons, that there has to be a team of people who are bought into the work, who are bought into what you're doing, and having that team and keeping that team alive, investing in that team, making that team important and listening to that team, making sure that team has training and that team is constantly engaged in moving the work forward. And then I would say that the third key to successful implementation that we've seen is having a communication plan that's a two-pronged approach. The first one is it is educating the stakeholders on how SEL contributes to academic success, and this includes parents. People need to know and to believe and to understand. So there's education and advocacy on behalf of the people who are leading the multi-year program, and then educating people on why it's important. So that's the education portion of it. Why is it important to do this work? Why are we spending the time? Because time is the issue. And so why are we spending this time doing this work? If those for us over the years have been sort of a proven formula for helping districts and schools have a successful implementation.
Thanks, Laura. I think that's those are both Peter and Laura. Those are valuable insights. Embedding this in teaching and learning, having a multi-year plan, having a foundation where people buy into the work and have bought into the work, and having communications with others. You know, both Larry and Dimitri have worked at the secondary level, and what I hear oftentimes from districts is that, you know, those are the most challenging levels to implement social emotional learning. So, you know, Larry, take us through some of your insights into what was successful implementation at the secondary level. What did you have to overcome, and what are some actions that people could take to promote effectiveness?
Yeah, I'll initially offer 3 actions that we've seen make a difference in terms of successful implementation. The first in our experience is starting with the leaders, building the understanding, the commitment, and active involvement of leaders. In fact, we think that's key to the success of SEL initiatives. And if the leaders aren't really invested and involved, then, you know, we see a lot of programs wither. And partly that means building their knowledge base, and also grounding them in a shared vision and shared language that they're going to use to drive the implementation after initial stages. So that's one, is start with the leaders. The second is commit to a systemic and holistic approach. And again, and this is our experience, we find that when districts and schools really have a vision of integrating SEL into the classroom, into student support, and into administrative practices, all guided by an MTSS framework, that they've been more likely to have success, rather than having a narrower focus to how they choose to implement. And in many cases, I think we see a lot of starting with the classroom. And partly that's where we see young people on a daily basis. So if we want to SEL to be touching young people on a daily basis, the classroom is an important place to start. And the third thing I would say is that, and again, this is especially true at the secondary level, I mean, probably most important at high school, but also at middle school, is to teach skills in a authentic and meaningful context, in which they need to be applied rather than teaching standalone lessons without any particular context. And so I'll give a quick example. If a teacher's gearing up to start cooperative groups, they could pause, and we're advocates of teaching mini lessons that are, you know, just in time or as needed for implementation for teaching and learning activities, really, and also classroom management and discipline. But in the case of cooperative learning, in our sort of framework, social efficacy would be the competency area. The skill area is cooperation and participation. And then we also identify desired target behaviors. And these are the things that often teachers in particular can latch onto. And so in this case, it might be, I take turns, listen to and encourage others, and do my fair share. So a mini lesson in that, followed by the implementation of cooperative groups the use of cooperative groups for some project for the next week, creates the seamlessness between teaching and learning and SEL implementation. And I think makes it seem more viable for secondary teachers in particular, because they see it really concretizes that link between academic and social and emotional learning.
Thanks, Larry. And those are very powerful insights. And thinking about teaching skills in context, it's a great transition to facing history and the work that, Dimitri, you've done. And in fact, I think both your organization and you yourself have worked on tackling some of the most challenging in the SEL skill arena, which is prejudice and tolerance, and helping students build respect for difference. So when you look at implementation in those areas, what accounts for success? What are the strategies that you think are most successful in implementation?
I think Larry and my colleagues, Peter and Laura, have already hit on it. It's remarkable. It's the same, it's really a similar thing. One is success is long-term view. These are not issues that you sort of do drive-by work. Oh, we had an incident or we had an interruption of something, we're gonna come in. So what we have seen success is when there's a long-term view and a long-term commitment. Commitment to invest in professional development of your teachers. We tend to work with middle schools and high schools. So in the districts where we're most successful is the districts that actually have committed resources for professional development for educators with the long-term plan. So Laura talked about a 3-year. Again, you need to be thinking about this because you're working with adult learners. The idea that you're going to send a group of teachers to one PD experiences and then that's it, you've got it, the solution, that's magical thinking, right? It's not realistic. So long-term investment in professional learning of your educators is important. What we have found as well is embedding SEL in classroom content and practices. So students are experiencing in the teaching, right? So we're journaling, we're having classroom discussions, we're doing pair shares, we're working in small groups, we're doing small group norms. So it's embedded in the practice of the classroom. We're having conversations, we're confronting issues of what's happening around us. So a lived reality, particularly for kids of color. So a lived reality is around race, issues of gender, issues of exclusion, issues of access of equity, a part of the learning, the legitimized space is made for those to be talked to be discussed and talked around. It increases the sense of value for the students and therefore will increase their own sense of engagement with their own learning and taking responsibility for their own learning. And then third, what we also have found to work is what Larry mentioned, the role of leadership. Again and again, when we have found success, is because the leaders in the systems have identified the priority, they've articulated a vision that teachers are therefore, and principals are therefore following. Because it's an articulated goal and vision, it becomes really difficult when it's not articulated to some larger district effort. The last thing I would close on is we say at Facing History, you cannot do SEL without equity. Nor can you do equity without SEL. You just can't. You won't have the environment, the space necessary to have the deep conversations around issues of race, exclusion, and our legacy of racial exclusion and how it influences schools today. You cannot also, therefore, look at these issues without SEL, right? Without the norms, without the safe and inclusive environment, without the trust in the educator who's leading those classroom discussions. So those two things are deeply intersected. And finally, our third leg is civic action, right? You cannot do that, especially with adolescents, if you're not prepared and ready to make space for voice and agency. The thing of working with high school students and middle school students is they have opinions. You will hear their thinking. You will hear their thoughts. So making space for them to practice that democratic skill of being a democratic citizens with voice and agency go hand in hand in your effort for SEL and equity. So it works best when you embed and when you integrate it, rather than thinking of these things as separate efforts.
Dimitri, thank you. And you've opened up a number of topics that we're going to come back to. In fact, let me mention in the Padlet, there is one of the little buckets in the Padlet is around equity. and the link between SEL and equity. And there's at least one article, and maybe there'll be other articles that get contributed around that topic. And I think that's important. But you've also raised, I think all of you've raised the issue about staff professional development and building staff capacity. And we know that building the capacity of staff to implement programs and strategies is critical to the success. You've all expressed that. So what advice can you offer about the development of staff capacity? What is it that really supports staff in owning the work, in being capable of doing the work in the classroom, and of reflecting on that and continually refining it? And Demetri, let me just come back to you, because you raised that in a very direct way, and I'll go through each of the four of you, but follow that up, and as you've experienced.
So again, I think allowing for investing in professional development, so allowing your staff and teams of your staff to go and learn the variety of SEL programs that are there that they can want to bring into the schools. But what also works really well have been districts where the superintendents were willing to allow the staff to create their own program. So they develop a vision for how they would want to do. We've been in places, we had one superintendent, for example, in Louisville, Kentucky, I won't name who invested in a 9th grade team and gave them a full year to think through of a course that would integrate civic learning, as well as integrating all of the principles of SEL, equity, and student voice and agency at the 9th grade. But the team of educators in the district decided what they were going to teach, where they were going to place it, how they were going to engage. What the district provided them and the district leader provided them was the resources, the time, and the space to do that. They selected to work with us and with other organizations. So again, when you educators have a sense that it's their program rather than something from the outside that they're being asked to implement, you will find greater commitment to it, and it will outlive the shift in district leadership, because there will be an internal sense of ownership over it.
Great, thanks. And since we're at secondary, Larry, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. One is that we have shifted in recent years to preparing leaders through turnkey training to actually provide professional learning opportunities for their staff. And we've gone even further than that after initial turnkey training, where they do implement an accountability structure. They use look-for tools, so they become the instructional leaders for SEL. And we've had a lot of success with that. And we get the feedback kind of on the side that the leaders, building level leaders in particular, are especially appreciative for just feeling like they're better instructional leaders generally, in addition to supporting the SEL initiative. So that's been part of how we've approached professional learning in recent years. And I would echo what's been said. You need to have generous professional learning time and think creatively about how to get that time. If there aren't enough professional development days, think about common planning time, think about faculty meetings. You can slice and dice and work differently. We do a lot of work with cohorts, and those can be at middle school level, could be grade level teams. At secondary level, they might be departmental teams, they might be course-alike teachers, they might be 9th grade teams, so that there is a cohort actually involved in professional learning together that interacts over time around implementation issues. That's been an important part of our model too. And then the last thing I'd say is that we have found that it's very important to scaffold and prioritize implementation strategies. So I'll give a very specific example. A lot of schools that we partner with and districts have prioritized the whole category of personalized relationships, particularly because of the big research base around the foundational importance of belonging and connection. And so they've identified and started with strategies like meet and greet, for example, where, again, going back to our framework, it's a social efficacy competency. The skill set is healthy relationships, and the The desired target behavior is I greet and talk with people in a friendly manner. And that becomes a regular part of day-to-day activity. Then also personal check-ins, extensive personal check-ins by teachers with students, even brief personal check-ins. And then the use of both gatherings and circle as formats all contribute to personalized relationships with and among students. So it's not only the personalized relationship of the adult and students, it's fostering personalized relationships and a sense of community in the classroom.
So let me follow up on that, Larry, and just say, how long does it take? How when you're working with a cohort, what's your sense of what success is over time? How long do you spend with a group?
I would echo what I think everyone has said. This takes time because you're looking at, you're not only preparing adults to implement SEL, you have to simultaneously be supporting adult SEL development. And, and so because of that dual focus, in particular, it takes time. People should think, as Laura started it off, multiple year plans. Ideally, we partner with the district for multiple years. The work we do together changes over time, and it's gratifying to watch capacity spread and deepen over time, and ownership of and leadership for program implementation to shift from us to the district. But it takes multiple years really to achieve the kind of outcomes that you're looking for. The kinds of outcomes that would be reported on climate surveys, shifts in, improvement in grade point average and pass and fail rates in middle school, any other measures that you're using to look at SEL more specifically. It takes time. Now, it doesn't mean nothing happens for multiple years. It's a gradual process of change in our experience, and you can start to see some pretty immediate outcomes right away.
Great. And, Laura, I know the Center for Responsive Schools has really created a sort of scaffolded plan for professional development. But in your experience, what works in staff development? How have you seen this play out?
Well, I think the thing that works is that you are designing, you recognize, first of all, you're working with adult learners, and that adult learners have needs. And one of the things that adult learners need, is to build on what Larry said, is that they need to be able to have something that's practical and that they can implement immediately, that changes their knowledge, skills, disposition, or their practice. They need to feel success. So if you're putting them into professional development, although it's a multi-year approach, it needs to be delivered in such a way that adults can feel successful immediately, that they can walk out, I can do something. Because teachers are practitioners and they need tools to practice. So for us at the Center for Responsive Schools, using our flagship program, Responsive Classroom, we have a system, we have an implementation program that takes you educators through a journey. So we have workshops, which are what we would call these short focused workshops. They are on concise, specific practices or problems of practice, and how you can use responsive classroom practices to address those student learning needs or classroom management needs or disciplinary needs. And then we have our courses, which are designed to actually influence teacher beliefs, influence teacher behaviors, influence teachers' knowledge, their skills, their competence, so that when they walk out of the courses, they're ready to implement immediately some practices that they have some control over, that they can feel successful. One of the other things that adults need is they need to feel like their experiences are respected. That's an adult learning need. And so when we come to professional development, part of what we want to do is be able to integrate that notion that you're not coming here because you don't know anything or you aren't doing it right. We want to help you to do it better. We want to help you to get to your student learning needs. And that student, because right now, the change that we're implementing is really about improving student success, whether it's academic success, behavioral success, whether it is their social success, whatever this is, we're doing it in service to the students. And what we're doing through the professional development is improving your capacity to do that. So that is a leadership conversation, but also when the educators are in the professional development, the experience needs to be, the professional development experience needs to feel like this isn't a one and done. I can go on a journey. I can learn. And I am in a community of like-minded people. I think one of my colleagues mentioned this sense of belonging. One of the things that we've really recognized, we teach in our workshops, is that kids have 3 needs: belonging, significance, and fun. So do adults. So you can really make those about human needs. And so adults need to have fun when they're learning. Fun actually facilitates the memory, activates the memory processors. So I think the part of the role of how do we keep moving educators through and build their capacity, it's really about well-designed professional development that's intended to, give them something that they can feel successful, that respects their experiences, and that allows them to see themselves in progress. For example, one of the tools that we provide to educators who take our the responsive classroom approach is we provide them a tool for self-assessment, not for the educators to assess, but for the implementers to assess themselves, because we aren't evaluating them. They're in professional development for professional growth. And if we are continuous learners, we're continuing to learn. So we try to provide the RC practitioners with the tools that they need. So I think that there's also, how do you make sure that people see themselves as growing, that this isn't about you arrived at a space, but it's continuous growth. So we really do work to strengthen the leader's understanding of focusing on growth toward change, and growth toward improvement, growth toward capacity, rather than seeing it as a destination, that you're going to take this and you're now going to be this perfect practitioner of something.
Thanks, Laura. Peter, you've been working in the arena of professional development, not only in SEL, but in reading as well. And so as you look at this, what moves teachers to refine their practice? What are the insights that you've had?
I think actually something Laura said is important to restate, which is, I think it's really essential that teachers see the professional learning as practical, as something they can walk away and be successful with. One of the things I think it's emerging in the field of professional learning, the research on professional learning, is the importance of connecting sort of teachers' ongoing learning to the stuff they use every day. So to curriculum itself. I think oftentimes, certainly when I started as a staff developer, we were teaching strategies. We were teaching sort of generic things teachers might do in their classrooms without embedding it in the curriculum that teachers were using every day. And one of the things we found to be really important and essential to helping teachers shift their practice is making sure that professional learning aligns with and is connected to the materials teachers are using every day. I think that's just really fundamental, because it's the only way to sustain this work over time. At least in our experience, it's been really important. So that's one thing I think that it's just important to restate. I think is really important, which also bellies the idea that in the social emotional learning, it's really important that you select resources and curriculum that marries the sort of pedagogy and philosophy that you want as a district. I think that choice is a really important one, and there are lots of great choices out there, but it's important to get one that sort of aligns with your belief systems, because when you do the professional learning, I feel like that all has to be in sync. The other thing I would just say is, I think this gets at sort of how do we help teachers be successful, and it connects to something Larry and Dimitri talked about actually, and it's this, when we put teachers working in partnership, like to help kids learn social skills, to work in partnerships or small groups, one of the things that's essential is it be relevant to kids, and they have to see the utility in using these skills. But I think that requires a shift in the teacher as well, because what now she has to deal with is this idea that kids actually need to mess up in their partnerships. They need to struggle in them. They need to make a bunch of mistakes. They need to be working with people they find challenging. And that those problems are actually make the social skills you're learning really relevant, right? It helps me navigate the real social challenge, and that allows us to get to the, to share ideas and to do the academic work or whatever we're working on. And I feel like that shift in a teacher is important, because that means then that we're teaching social skills for engagement versus compliance. Like, I'm not teaching it so kids are just having smooth, so that we have no problems in our classroom. I'm actually teaching these skills because I anticipate challenge, and I'm arming my kids with the skills they need to sort of navigate the world of people, of relationships that are murky and messy and hard. And so I think that professional learning also gets at that as well, which is why I think connecting it to the curriculum is so important, because it has to be, we have to be successful as we do it. And so anyway, that's how I think about it.
Well, Peter, let me ask you to build on that in a way. When you're working in the arena of social development or social and emotional development, you're actually tapping into sort of deep feelings, a lot of history in each person's life. How do we, through our work, help teachers become more reflective about their own interactions, their language, their behavior, so that they begin to see how not only their lessons, but their own presence in the classroom influences the social and emotional environment of the classroom?
Yeah, this is such an important question. I mean, I'll make a plug just for actually a book that the Center for Responsive Schools publishes. Paula Denton's classic book, The Power of Our Words, is something I certainly use a lot in my work as well, even today. The impact of our language has on kids, and teachers being sort of conscious and of how what they're saying impacts what happens for kids and the experience of kids in schools. And so one of the things I would say, we talked about adult SEL a little bit. Larry and Dimitri talked about this idea of how important it was that teachers, we worked on this with teachers. And what I would say is that when teachers experience what Parker Palmer talks about, this idea of being of relational trust, of fundamentally feeling connected in school, that I think that is the birthplace around which we can help them be reflective about their own practice. They can, I think, when they have really powerful relationships with their colleagues and with their, the principal and with their coaches, that they're able to receive feedback in ways that they can actually do something with it. Sometimes I think teachers are getting feedback from folks that they don't have a great relationship with, or they don't have a lot of respect for. That makes it really hard for them to actually shift their practice in ways that are going to be really helpful for kids and allow kids to thrive. And so I don't know, there's lots of ways to get at the answer to your question, Shelley, but I think one of the ways is to help teachers be really reflective about their practice. And I think it's really hard to be reflective about your practice if you don't feel a strong sense of connection or belonging. Because it's hard to do that alone, because you need sort of someone else to sort of sit with you and question you and give you hard feedback and have hard conversations. And it's hard to do that. I would say almost impossible to do that if I don't feel that sort of strong sense of connection. So one way we get at that work is through just an ongoing way in the work itself of trying to help teachers feel connected to one another and safe to have the kinds of conversations that are going to push this work forward.
Thanks, Peter. And you referenced Power of Our Words, which I think is really an extraordinary document. And so let me pass it over back to Laura. Just your organization is the author of that document. But what are your insights about? You talked a little bit about teacher beliefs and moving teachers' beliefs and their own sense of self in the classroom and who they are in the classroom.
So yeah, thank you, Shelley. We do have a book, The Power of Our Words, authored by Paula Denton. And it really does cover the types of language, what teacher language is, and how we use it, and how we can inspire kids, we can help them through their social, emotional, and academic growth, and really helps teachers to change how they think about the power of their words. I was in a workshop in New York about 2 years ago. I guess that was right before the pandemic hit. And it was one of our advanced courses, and we were doing some advanced work on teacher language. And a teacher started to feel, this is going to the belief system, she started to feel shifts in her beliefs. And this is how I was able to recognize that this teacher was able to shift in her beliefs, because she became very uncomfortable with talking about teacher language. And she began to challenge herself, but it was an open challenge actually aimed at the presenter. And she was with her colleagues, and she started to say, but I talk to my kids this way, they know what I mean, and I'm more like a mother to them. And I think a lot of us have made that same mistake as educators. We do get into we're the in parentis locus, and we love them like they're our children. And sometimes we talk to them in ways that are familiar in our families, but might not be the best for us as professional educators. And as she was struggling with this, her beliefs were shifting, and you could see that she was beginning to see that perhaps the way she talked to her students really wasn't motivating them as much as it was being a mother figure that sometimes would allow her to cross boundaries that she would otherwise not cross. So part of the PD that we do, as Peter mentioned, really does help teachers to think about how they talk, how to use their words in ways that really do empower kids to be in control of themselves, that really does empower kids to remember the rules and to manage themselves in the classroom environment. And we really use it as a part of our discipline approach as much as we do as a part of managing the teachers. So teachers begin to see how they can use their words to be more effective, to have a more effective discipline approach. So it's a very, I think it makes an appreciable difference in the lives of teachers when they learn to use their words in effective ways.
I'm going to come back to discipline in a moment with another question, but let me continue on this theme though of teachers' self-reflection. And Dimitri, I'm going to go to you in terms of, you talked a lot about equity, and you talked about, and Facing History deals with the issues of race and discrimination and intolerance. And how have you worked so that, teachers reflect on their own behavior, their own attitudes, their own beliefs?
Thank you. I was actually going to lean in and say, hey, Shelley, can I speak to that point? Because I think it's so the piece about self-reflection we probably have found is probably one of the most effective elements of professional development for teachers. Creating that space for self-reflection, giving the opportunities for it, the feedback loop. Sometimes it's easier for our staff who are external to the life of the school to be able to provide that, because we're not evaluating them, we're not writing them up, we're not involved in that day-to-day. So I do think school leaders should think very carefully for where and who in your school building should be doing that kind of role in creating the capacity. But creating that space for self-expression is critical. So for example, in the equity work that we do, we have developed a set of training called Teaching for Equity and Justice. And a lot of our work about teaching for equity and justice is about shifting mindsets. It's helping educators develop equity mindsets that move them away from the deficit thinking that many of us bring in as adults, particularly when we work with kids of color. It's our decisions oftentimes to not understand the legacy of our history of exclusion, marginalization, and discrimination. Those things exist and continue to have a life of their own in our institutions. So if we don't become self-aware of these things, and if we're not able to reflect on our practice, our language, and the ways we teach, and even the way we think of intelligence and who has it, who doesn't have it, it impacts our practice as educators. So we need to provide in our teaching on equity and justice a lot of space for that kind of self-reflection in order to help them develop these kind of mindsets. But in addition to it, going back to adult learners again, These are adult learners, right? So we're working with the hard realities of history and literature and how we see one another over time. All of us were students at one point. And so we have had histories that we have learned in particular way with gaps, with deficit, with false narratives. So again, unless you provide that adult learner space to also say, how did I learn the history of Reconstruction period after the Civil War? Maybe my own history and my own learning around this had gaps, and therefore I ought to challenge myself now to begin to rethink and take a new perspective. So unless we are able to create that space for self-reflection, you will find that a lot of your professional development training is actually not going to be terribly effective. So the feedback loop, self-reflection is as important as the actual professional development training.
Yeah, thank you, Dimitri. Larry, you want to jump in on that conversation?
I'll just add one thing, and I want to pick up on the thread of creating a culture that supports reflection and a safe space for adults to take risks and a sense of community where they can share with one another. We had I'm thinking of one particular story. One of the protocols that we teach is a planning and problem solving conference. In the MTSS language, it's a teacher facilitated tier 2 intervention. And we were working in a school, and part of what we did is we first modeled what a planning and problem solving conference would look like with some of the kids from a teacher's classroom. And it was around behavior kinds of issues. And our facilitator engaged them in the protocol. And afterwards, the teacher was really struck and spoke up about her sense of being surprised and kind of shocked that her students could think in the way they were thinking, they could express themselves, they could problem solve, they could see the issues around what their behavior was creating, and contribute to thinking about what could be done about it. And she was, I think, in part upset with herself that she wasn't making that happen. What happened though afterwards is she went on, after having the opportunity to be reflective with us and with a group of teachers, she went on determined to try implementing this herself and had success. And what it also speaks to is the shift in mindset that can occur in adults, where they see young people in a different light. They see side dimensions of young people that they don't necessarily see in their, and haven't necessarily seen in the course of day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year experience. And so there can be this shift in mindset that corresponds with a shift in a sense of what doing things differently can lead to and yield. So that's where I'd weigh in. I think creating a culture for reflection linked to experiences with practices is very powerful.
All of you talked about, and I think Larry, you surfaced this, and that sense of community that we try to create in the classroom, that's enriching for students, is the kind of community that we need to create for teachers. And that within that community, there has to be safety for self-reflection and vehicles and time to support that, whether those are coaches or whether those are external individuals who come in to do professional development and facilitate that kind of interaction. It's a vital one. I know we only have a couple minutes left, and I want to address one fairly significant question that I believe is on many people's minds in our audience, and that is that across the country there's emerged a great deal of controversy around critical race theory, and some have actually linked it to social emotional learning and conflated it with social emotional learning and with other issues. But if we are going to go deep in social emotional learning, and if social emotional learning is going to reflect some of the issues that Dimitri raised around equity, and if we are going to be talking about race, how do teachers and administrators respond when people raise the issue of objecting to critical race theory. So I'm going to bounce around a little bit. I'm going to begin with Peter and just ask Peter to jump in on this.
Well,
Actually, I'm going to close with you. So on that.
I mean, I think for me, it also centers around the thing I was talking about a little earlier around helping kids sort of develop the kinds of skills that are going to help them really thrive. And, you know, school, when it's most effective, centers around the things that matter most to kids and that are central to kids' lives and their communities and in their place in the world. And I can't imagine not empowering and equipping kids with what they need to be able to sort of dig into these problems, to analyze these problems, to engage with each other around these problems, to feel a sense of agency around these problems. And so in my mind, you know, when a school wants to break down the kinds of, you know, they think of the kind of person they want to walk out their doors at the, you know, at the end of 12th grade, and they look at the kindergartner now. And you think about the kinds of habits of mind, of skills, of dispositions, learning experiences that are going to help them be that kind of person. And the kinds of skills we're talking about here are sort of fundamental to that. And fundamental to seeing themselves, advocating for themselves, and seeing that they have a place at the table. And so I you know, it is I don't know that you can have you know, a thoughtful, engaged, fully present young person there without sort of fundamentally engaging these social learning skills. And if you want to, you know, I think when you look at sort of what it means to be a critical reader, a critical thinker, someone who's engaged critically in our democracy, these are sort of, I think, fundamental skills that are going to allow us to thrive. Not teaching them seems to me to be a recipe for disaster.
All right. Well, thanks, Peter. Larry?
You know, I mean, a couple things come to mind. One is starting with questions. You know, if you encounter an objection to you know, assumption, first of all, an assumption that you're teaching critical race theory and an objection to that, you know, starting with questions. You know, what do you mean by critical race theory? What's your definition of critical race theory? And what do you think we're doing that you find objectionable? And using that to engage in a conversation. And I realize how fraught conversations can be, because often it's really not, you know, there's a lot of emotion around when, you know, this is a good example of something where there's a lot of emotion that clouds what information might exist. I think in the end, though, what schools need to do is establish, if need be, their own definitions of terms. You know, we do social emotional learning. Here's what it means. Here's what it doesn't mean. Here's our understanding of critical race theory. We don't teach critical race theory. We do engage in students in study of history around and issues related to race in our country in the following sorts of ways. Here's our approach. You know, I realize that that doesn't necessarily deal with the sort of political side of how emotional this might get in a setting, but you know, I think we need educators, and we need to take the high road and try to establish definitions around what we do and don't do, and take a stand on what we do and explain it to people.
Thanks, Larry. Laura?
The time is short for this, so I would say that I would echo what both Larry and Peter said, and probably what Dimitri will say, in that I do believe that there are, part of this is a war of words. You know, it is when you ask me if CRS through our program teaches critical race theory, I would say absolutely not. But do we, in our practices, help educators become aware of themselves and any unconscious biases that they might hold? We absolutely do. If you ask me if we help educators to think about culturally responsive practices that they can use, we absolutely do. If you ask me if we teach them critical race theory, we do not, because it's not our area. So I think that it is an area that's fraught with difficulty because it is an emotionally charged, as Larry said, area. I think educators have a responsibility to their students to make sure that they have safe, predictable environments where students can learn and they can engage in dialogue and in difficult dialogue. We provide and teach educators structures to manage that dialogue. The work that we do is content agnostic. So you can use responsive classroom practices to teach swimming, to teach basketball, or to teach kids math and reading. It's a content agnostic content. So we don't have content. And with our SEL curriculum, it is teaching the social and emotional skills that kids need to be successful. And it is teaching them in ways, we actually have a literacy base for teaching those. But I do think that, so from an organizational standpoint, I think that each organization has a responsibility, and each educator, because we're serving educators. At the end of the day, we're serving children. And we have responsibilities to help create environments where kids can thrive and they can see themselves. If there's an issue of what I think is representation, I think representation in the curriculum, our SEL curriculum clearly has representation in it. It is because we think that representation is important.
Great. Thank you. And Dimitri? You're on mute.
I think that, with very few minutes left, we're going to address like the hot topic. So definitely not something to do in the classroom. Don't leave the hot topic for like the 5 minutes before the bell, because that's bound to erupt in your classroom.
Thanks for the feedback.
But here, I think every school leaders, particularly today here, should be thinking, I think, as Larry, Peter, and Laura said, and start thinking and prepare for what your responses will be. Because I think, as Shelley mentioned, this issue about SEL and CRT is going to come up. You should expect it. It's probably already brewing in your school systems. So you ought to have a response. This is where leadership is really critical. I think if leaders have an understanding for why they're doing what they're doing, what's happening in the schools, why we're adopting SEL, and if you can link it to the teaching and learning that you envision, you will find that that rationale actually is going to help you weather through the storm, but you'll go through the storm. I think when you think about the work on SEL and the confrontation with equity and developing student voice, we do it, I think, for 3 reasons. One, we're trying to raise academic achievement. And in order to raise academic achievement, we need to create safe and inclusive environment for learning. That's how learning thrives. So it is a pedagogical, we're doing this because this is good teaching and learning. In order to, again, raise academic achievement, we need to create a culture in all of our schools where we're fostering and cultivating curiosity. We have to do it early on in elementary schools. We have to keep going in middle schools and high school and foster and cultivate curiosity. And you do that by multiple perspective taking, by discomfort, by raising questions and so on, again, because that's how you raise academic achievement. And finally, I think you do this as well, all of the work on SEL and equity, because we need to make learning relevant and meaningful. In order for students to learn best, what they're learning has to seem relevant, it has to be meaningful, and has to be able to help me understand myself and the world around me. That, again, is good teaching and learning. And I think if you can anchor your efforts on SEL, equity, and civic education along those 3 rationale, it is good teaching and learning, and not get distracted by the political forces that are going to, of course, attempt to distract.
Well, Dimitri and Laura, Larry, Peter, thank you. I mean, we could continue this conversation in many other ways, and there are many other topics, and your insight really experiences that you've had and that the insights you've offered to the group who's listening is going to make a difference in their own practice. So I thank you. And I know that we now have an opportunity for people to meet individually with each one of you. So let me just explain the process so we can go a little bit deeper and you can have an exchange with individuals who are been watching this webinar so far. So for those in the audience who are watching or those participating, you will see that there is a room button on the bottom of your screen, or if you're using a pad, it's on the top. And once you click that button, you will then be able to move. You'll see 4 names come up. You will have to choose one. You won't be able to flip from one to the other, but you will choose one to go in and follow up and continue the conversation. So I want to thank all of you for the very rich, valuable conversation you've shared, and for all the work you've done. And thank you for maintaining the work in terms of the struggles it is to maintain a nonprofit in a environment like this. So congratulations and thank you.